I'm Jesse Bifulco, host of the LifeCounsel podcast. I've been an estate planning and elder law attorney for many years. I teach by telling stories. Together, we'll demystify estate planning, hopefully get entertained, but also focus on some important stuff about life, family, and legacy too. Yes, legacy is a big part of LifeCounsel podcast. Today I'm going to talk about a hot topic in the news, but it's also a question I get asked in my estate planning meetings with clients more often than you'd think. It's something that is legal in 10 states, and maybe soon New York might become the 11th. But what exactly is it? Today's story brings you into what I call a design meeting. I'm not just the host of this podcast. I'm also a practicing estate and elder law attorney. Although to be clear, this podcast is separate from that and not meant to advertise those services. Design meetings are confidential meetings with clients. They're conversations to design their estate plan. The conversation goes like this. Let's talk about managing your estate, your assets, your money, your house. Who would do that for you if you were mentally incapacitated? Maybe you're not so bad off. You just need someone to come by once in a while. Or maybe there's a risk. You might leave the stove on and burn down the house. Or perhaps you cannot live without 24/7 supervision. At that point, with this particular kind of person, they say something like, well, Maine has that new law, right? I can just say to end my life at that point, right? What they're saying is that if they were ever mentally incapacitated, they think the law allows someone to end their life. And then I've got to explain what the law in Maine really is. Because of all the people who've raised the issue in my client meetings, not one of them has understood how the law works. And that's a pet peeve of mine. It is how badly misunderstood Maine's Death with Dignity Act is. I'm going to tell you what Maine's Death with Dignity law is, what it isn't, and why the difference matters. If you're not from Maine, you should still listen if you want to know the state of assisted suicide laws in the United States, because it may be coming to a theater near you soon, like New York, where it's being debated. It's already legal in California, Colorado, D.C., Hawaii, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. But what exactly is it? Remember, we tell stories in this podcast. So let me tell you some more real-life stories. Let's start out by asking a silly question. Is there an embarrassing way to die? Have you ever done something really stupid and then looked around you and said to yourself, boy, it's a good thing no one saw that? What if the really stupid thing was the last thing you ever did? Like taking a selfie on a 200-foot cliff after being warned about slippery rocks. Or like getting crushed by a vending machine that you shoved. Or like tripping over your own beard. A beard you grew dangerously long on purpose so you could get into the Guinness Book of World Records. Or maybe the last thing you ever did was ride a Segway off a cliff after you yourself had invented the Segway. These are true stories of fatal accidents. You can look them up, and there are many more like them. All of them involved a questionable decision on the part of the doomed individual that turned out to be fatal. When you read them, you feel a twinge of sympathetic embarrassment or shame. The decision part of these tragedies is what gets me. They all chose to do the dumb thing that ended their lives. That gets me because I've done stupid things that, in hindsight, I know that before the dumb thing happened, I had a brief moment, an opportunity to do the smarter thing, and yet still chose the dumb thing. Usually out of haste, like cutting your finger with a knife. You know the right way to chop vegetables, but you choose to do it the wrong way because you're in a hurry. But if you cut your finger, you get a second chance to choose better the next time. Not so in these true life examples. Those poor people only got one chance to make the right decision. How might they have chosen to do things differently if they knew that what they were about to do would be their legacy? Some deaths aren't just sad, they're a little embarrassing. You hear stories about folks passing away in strange ways, and the way they leave this world becomes the legacy they leave behind. And speaking of legacies, if you stick around to the end of the show, I've got a story for you about a man who wrote his last will and testament on something a little more unusual than a sheet of paper. If you listen to the podcast in episode 5, called What Happened to Claire's Inheritance, you already know what a holographic will is. That is a will that's handwritten by the person making it, often without a lawyer involved. But here's a question. Must a holographic will be written on paper to be enforceable? Stick around, because before we're through today, I'll tell you the real-life story of a man who, in his final moments, needed to make a will but had no paper. Now getting back to my silly question about whether there's such a thing as an embarrassing way to die. I had a conversation once with a friend at a cocktail party. Somehow I managed to say this phrase, quote, "What an embarrassing way to die," unquote. And the friend said in reply, "How can it be embarrassing? You're not there to experience it." That statement struck me. It stuck with me because it feels obvious, and yet it undermines the driving motivation central to the identity of many, many people. And that is that something of you lives on after death. Also, denying that it is even possible to have an embarrassing death goes against the natural feeling of shame or embarrassment we instinctively feel for the victims of their own dumb mistakes, like those that I mentioned in the beginning. It also begs the question, is embarrassment only relevant to the living? Can one experience a shameful or undignified death? Putting aside the question of literal life after death, for now, there are things we associate with ourselves that persist after death. This is the effect of our death on the living. When they reflect on their own mortality, many people reflect specifically upon the personal markers that continue after death. As an estate planning and elder law attorney, I know this to be true. Trust me, I've interviewed thousands of people. Most of the people I've interviewed are deeply concerned about their legacy, about posterity, and about what might be called figurative immortality. The word posterity refers to all future generations of people. Posterity encompasses the legacy and impact that one leaves behind after death. It's the idea that one's actions, creations, and achievements will be remembered and valued by those who come after them. Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, were written by him with the intention of ensuring his artistic influence would endure long after his death. Shakespeare wrote this line in one of his sonnets. This is something the kids would call a meme, right? Quote, "So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." In the first 17 sonnets, often called the procreation sonnets, Shakespeare practically pleads with a youth to procreate, that is, to have children so that his beauty won't be lost to time. So children or descendants, that's one kind of life after death. That's one kind of posterity. But then Shakespeare's focus shifts. Poetry becomes his way to achieve immortality. So art becomes a way to have a personal effect on the world after you're dead. And while not all people have children, although if you can, I highly recommend it, but even if you can't, all people make a lasting work of art, whether they know it or not. That lasting work of art is the way they lived, and a part of that work of art is also the way they die. Looking at it that way, some people explain the interest in one's legacy as a fear of being forgotten. But I think that misses the mark, because we're not going to soon forget those people who died in those absurd ways. So they achieved, kind of being remembered. But it's so trivial to think that anyone thinks of their art or children as little boxes to hold a memory of their having existed. Sounds more like a tombstone than a legacy. The legacy we're talking about is so much more than a descendant or a poem as some kind of receptacle for the memory of the deceased parent or artist. Do we have any memory of Shakespeare from his sonnets? I mean in a personal way, like a personal memory, like the way you remember your mother from how she touched your cheek, or the scent of your father after he came into the house from working in the garden all morning. No, and yet Shakespeare has definitely left a legacy. Reading Shakespeare gives you a sense of his internal life, for sure, and maybe that was the best part of the guy. But it isn't the same as remembering a person. As a person you touched during your life will remember you. Just as a child or grandchild, or even a friend for that matter, who has been gifted with the inner sense of having been loved by you or somebody, just as that's a legacy. But it's not the same thing as a poem. My friend's mom painted landscapes without a single lesson. The family showed her paintings to experts who thought they were masterpieces. She didn't paint to create a legacy or even sell her work. It just naturally flowed out of her. The visual impact of seeing all these paintings hung in their living room felt like opening a treasure vault. Shakespeare's legacy is more than a book of his poems, because even if all of his poems and plays disappeared, his impact would live on in our culture. Likewise, even if those personal memories of your parents diminish in time or are lost to your memory, the family culture your parents imparted to you, your work ethic or honesty or faith, their real legacy will continue in you and your family, and on all those you touch during your life. Whether we know it or not, even without any intention to create a legacy, legacy flows out of us to posterity. When I'm meeting with my estate planning clients, it's obvious and a real privilege to get a glimpse of their legacy. I've seen it countless times, and when they're focused on giving a gift to their loved one, whether they address it with humor or sentiment or laconic grace, they become transformed. It's hard to communicate, and I don't want to sound like there's some kind of movie magic, lighting, or anything like that, but there's definitely something changed about them. Their clothes, their status, the material things that they brought with them lose focus, and this concern, or I guess you could call it love, occupies the forefront of their expression. I'm thinking of one in particular. I think if you saw this man in Rennie's, if you gave him a thought at all, it would have been a negative impression. Kind of short, a face kind of worn out, maybe from more than just aging. Clothes could have been a cleaner for sure, and if you got near him, he had the stale, unpleasant odor of a failing body. This grandfather did not have a huge estate, and many aspects of his life had gone wrong. His only daughter was lost to drug dependency. But when he spoke of his grandson and how his estate would help the boy, despite his losses and mistakes, that intention, coupled with the sacrifices he'd made so there would be a gift for his grandson, transformed him in some way. And I've seen it countless times. Then there are those who express a serene sense of comfort at the thought of passing, but not as though they're looking forward to dying. Rather, it's like they've got things in good order, like they felt satisfied they'd done their part, and so they don't seem to feel reluctant to plan for the inevitable. The physicists listening, hopefully, will cut me some slack in my analogy, because everyone knows I'm not a scientist. But the first law of thermodynamics and the law of conservation of mass come to mind as an analogy. Those physical laws say something like this: that energy is not created or destroyed, and that matter is not created or destroyed, but they merely change form. Well, in a sense, we're all matter and energy, but we're also something more than that. I like to think that the good we do is not lessened because we die, if in our own unique and personal way, we've translated into the world something good or beautiful. We've managed to convert a tiny piece of the whole great mass of potential good into some realized actual good. And that doesn't go away just because we die. The good we managed to do has a life apart from our own, a kind of conservation of decency. So what does that have to do with whether or not there's such a thing as an embarrassing way to die? To put it another way, since death is inevitable and it's largely out of our control, is it possible to have an undignified death? Because the issue comes up often enough to notice in my client meetings, some people seem to be worried they might have an undignified death. I think it's related to legacy, but it's different. They worry that their final days will be humiliating. I'm not referring to worries about pain. That's not their worry. These folks are worried about the possibility of losing their mental capacity, about being physically or mentally dependent on others before they die. When reflecting on that possibility, they say something like, we have that law here in Maine, right? Like I was saying in the beginning. So they seem to think that they can say in advance that if I'm ever that bad off, they can just end my life, right? Well, who's that, right? Who's going to end your life? What that client is asking about is what I referred to before, Maine's assisted suicide law. They're referring to Maine's assisted suicide law, which is misnamed the Death with Dignity Act. Why is it misnamed? It's misnamed because it isn't death or dignity, right? What it is suicide. Death is something that happens to us. Suicide is something we do. Let's take it apart legally, because the name of the law, even the previous way it was titled, are not true, but were words deliberately contrived to conceal what the law really is. You may agree or disagree about whether or not this is a good law, but before we can even get to that, we ought to understand why it is a departure from previous understandings of legal culpability for death or being liable for causing another to die. That sounds kind of technical and highfalutin, but all I mean by legal culpability for death is this. Prior to this law, if you caused someone else to die, you were called a murderer. You might not go to jail, say if you acted in self-defense, but having a defense to murder did not make you not a murderer. You just had a defense, and so the law would not punish you for committing that act. What that means is that we had to identify clearly, both for ourselves, for our group, and under the rules, that is society at large, what is murder and who's a murderer. Why is that relevant to the Death with Dignity law? Putting aside the fact that they took the word suicide right out of it, whoever named this law deliberately chose to use words in a way that hides the fact that in order to give practical effect to the law, someone has to assist you. In other words, technically they could be considered a murderer, right? Accessory to murder, murderer. Think about the Matthew Perry case recently in the news. The famous actor had a notorious drug problem. He also had a prescription for ketamine. Now, apparently, the doctor who prescribed the ketamine is liable for murder in the state of California. But consider this. In 2016, the state of California adopted a law called the California End of Life Option, another deceptively named law. This law allows terminally ill adults to request medication from a physician that will end their life. Maine's law is similar. Perry asked a doctor for a prescription that turned out to be lethal. So why doesn't Perry's case fit into the end-of-life option, California's legal way? After passage of Maine's law, what those clients in my meetings are asking me is not if they can get a lethal prescription, which is what Maine's law is, but what they're really asking is if it's possible to consent in advance to being euthanized. Does Maine's assisted suicide law, what the legislature euphemistically titled the Death with Dignity Act, allow you to opt out if your life would feel humiliating to you? The answer is no, for now. Remember what my friend said at that cocktail party. How can you be embarrassed? You're not there to experience it. But that's not what my clients in these meetings were asking. Universally, all the clients who ask about this have a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Maine Law is. They want something more like a consent to euthanize me law than an assisted suicide law. But just imagine a place where someone is reading a patient's chart and such a thing was legal. Who is going to carry out this act? What's the standard? When exactly is it appropriate? Because that is not the law, these folks have not been asked to sign a statement instructing their caregivers to kill them if they're ever unable to express their intentions or are permanently mentally incapacitated. In other words, they haven't been put to the test to actually carry out what they say they want. So we'll never know if they really want it. But that's what they said they wanted. So I don't know if they really meant it or not. But why do none of them understand the law? That's my pet peeve. They know it exists, but they all share the same mistaken belief that it means something entirely different than what it actually means. I would argue that the reason they know there is a law but do not know its meaning is that the name of the law does not describe what it does. So, getting back to old Shakespeare for a minute, in his play Romeo and Juliet, Juliet asks, "What's in a name?" She said a rose would smell as sweet no matter what we called it. But with laws, names can do a lot more than smell sweet. They can hide what a law really does, or they can bring it right out into the daylight. When it comes to a law that lets people end their lives with a doctor's help, after generations of calling that murder and suicide, we owe it to ourselves and to each other to name such a law in a manner that people can understand. When asked for a title for Maine's Death with Dignity Act that actually made clear what it did, artificial intelligence came up with this answer, quote, "An act to allow terminally ill adults to end their lives with a doctor's help without it being murder or suicide," end quote. Well, that title would definitely avoid misinterpretation. And it would also do one more thing. It would signal a fundamental change in society's attitude towards suicide and one who helps somebody commit suicide. Because you cannot end your own life, suicide, if you cannot remember who you are or where you are or when to take your medications. Also, someone else cannot do it for you. In the law, a physician can prescribe and a pharmacist can fill a prescription for a drug that will end your life. But you have to be terminally ill and mentally competent. So why say, quote, end of life, quote, instead of suicide? Why say death instead of murder? Why say dignity at all, right? Literally, it's not the end of life because if it were, you wouldn't need to end it with a prescription. But also, what makes it dignified? Is it any more or less dignified than dying in battle or dying in one's sleep or slipping off a 200-foot cliff while trying to take a selfie? As an estate planning and elder law attorney, I have hundreds of conversations a year with folks who are contemplating their own deaths. They consider what it might be like to be terminally ill, and some of them, a fairly good percentage of them are terminally ill. They may worry about the cost of long-term care. They worry about the burden on their spouse and children. These are accomplished people. They built something in their lives that they can be proud of. I'm not necessarily referring to material wealth, although that may be part of their legacy. But there is something more than that, and it's hard to describe. It's a themness that you experience during that meeting. That is the product of their life, and it's so unique to each of us. A few, not many, express a kind of revulsion at the defilement of the themness that they contemplate could happen if one day they're not in control of their lives. That may be the understanding of wasting away in a mental fog or vegetable state as being undignified. Maine's law related to ending one's life, called the Death with Dignity Act, is not a law that allows you to consent in advance to being euthanized, as I mentioned before. And perhaps the reason people make that mistake is because the law it's named that way. So what is Maine's Death with Dignity Act? Well, it's physician-assisted suicide. Although 11 states have passed laws that allow someone to legally assist the terminally ill to end their lives, none of them use the word suicide. In the 2024 and 2025 legislative sessions, 7 states are considering assisted suicide laws, and none of those states are honest enough to use the word suicide in the title of their bills. If those bills pass, that would bring the total to 17 by statute and 1, Montana, by court precedent. But it begs the question, was suicide illegal before these laws? And if suicide is not illegal, why do we need a law legalizing suicide? Well, the answer is suicide's not illegal. Think about it. If someone succeeds, how are you going to prosecute them? The legal problem was not that suicide necessarily was illegal, but that people wanted help doing it. The Montana Supreme Court's decision clarifying that state's position on physician-assisted suicide illustrates the legal evolution of this idea, because the people who wish to commit suicide want help doing it. And if you help someone to die, usually you're charged with murder. Remember the famous Dr. Kevorkian? He rigged up these elaborate suicide helping machines for his patients. In Baxter v. State, the Montana court found that a physician who assists a terminally ill, mentally competent patient to commit suicide is immune from prosecution for homicide. It didn't say the doctors weren't taking part in homicide. It just said they're immune from prosecution. In Montana, that does not violate public policy. These were the legal hurdles that these statutes and the Montana court had to overcome. A centuries-old legal system predicated on the idea that encouraging suicide is against public policy, that physicians are healers and not accelerants of death, and that ending someone else's life before its natural termination is homicide, murder. These 3 foundational principles had to be navigated because these 3 threads are so interwoven with so many laws, rules, and regulations. The legislators had to figure out a way to carve exceptions to them without having to rewrite all those laws and without accidentally giving a murderer a defense to murder. In Maine, even prior to the Death with Dignity Act, suicide wasn't illegal. However, Maine law also recognizes a state interest in the preservation of life. At least it used to. There are now so many exceptions that it feels like these states are moving toward a default position that devalues rather than values life. So what did Maine's Death with Dignity law do? Well, passed in 2019, it allows mentally competent, terminally ill adults to request and self-administer a prescribed medication to bring about the patient's death. Before the law, assisted suicide was illegal under Maine's criminal statutes. After the law, it created a legal regulated process for physicians to prescribe life-ending medication under those specific circumstances and conditions. It did not legalize active euthanasia. That is, the doctors cannot administer the drug. Only the patient can self-administer. And they have to do it where no one can see them. Another sign that it's something that's not quite dignified, right? Because if it was so dignified, why wouldn't you allow it in public? The law created legal immunity for physicians and providers who comply with these rules. So, here's a final question. Since the people asking me about this law had in mind advanced consent to euthanasia and not legal physician-assisted suicide, should Maine or other states consider making what these people wanted legal? Or really, by giving the law such a misleading name, where the legislators try to push us further down the road toward normalizing this behavior. I know where I stand on the issue, and if there is enough interest in the topic, I'll address it in a future podcast. So tell me what you think. By the way, the American Medical Association is against this law because there's no way to reconcile their central mission with the idea of a doctor participating in accelerating the death of another. The recent investigations into premature organ harvesting should tell you that the AMA is correct on this. Look it up. They tried to take the organs out of a guy who was still alive and who was complaining about it. Really awful stuff, but you gotta see these stories to believe them. So before we wrap up today, I promised you a story about just how far last will and testament can stretch. If you listen to episode 5, What Happened to Claire's Inheritance, you already know that a holographic will is a will that's handwritten by the person making it, often without any lawyer or witnesses. Well, in 1948, a Canadian farmer got pinned under his tractor in an accident. He couldn't escape, and he knew the end was near. He scratched out his last will onto the fender of his tractor using his pocket knife. What do you think? Was it legal? He had no lawyer, no witnesses, not even a scrap of paper. Just his final wishes, scratched into metal in the middle of a field. Was it enough? The answer is yes. The court honored it as his last will and testament. It's a reminder that while planning ahead is always better, sometimes, even in our last moments, the simplest words, if they're clear and truly ours, can still carry a lifetime's meaning. I'm Jesse Bifulco, host of the LifeCounsel podcast. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed this, make sure you click like and subscribe. Until next time.